welcome back to the Vale Echo, where the shadows of history whisper their darkest secrets. Tonight, we step into the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, a city of gaslight and deception, to uncover the story of a man whose charm was deadlier than poison, George Joseph Smith, the killer who drowned his wives. The story begins on a damp London evening. The streets glisten under the flickering glow of gas lamps as a solitary figure walks through the mist, a well-dressed man in a bowler hat, his polished shoes tapping against the cobblestones. To strangers, he's polite, soft-spoken, even magnetic. But behind those cold, calculating eyes lies something far more sinister. George Smith knew exactly how to blend in. By day, he moved through crowded markets and smoky taverns with ease, a master of small talk. By night, he studied the lonely hearts advertisements in the newspaper, desperate women seeking love, companionship, or simply a future. And Smith was ready to give them exactly what they dreamed of at a price they'd never live to regret. One such woman, sitting alone in her small candle-lit flat, scans the ads and pauses at his words, "Gentleman seeks a sincere lady for marriage." She smiles faintly, unaware that the man behind those words is already planning her death. Their first meeting is straight out of a romance novel. A warm tea room, the clinking of porcelain cups, and the soft laughter of a woman who believes she's found her perfect match. Smith leans in, his voice smooth and reassuring. To her, he seems kind, a man who promises stability, love, and safety. But his eyes tell another story. Soon after, there's a wedding, a small church, a smiling bride, and a groom whose heart is as cold as the stone beneath their feet. To onlookers, it's a picture of happiness. To Smith, it's just another signature, another name added to his growing list. Days later, the couple rents a modest room at a quiet boarding house for their honeymoon. The walls are adorned with floral wallpaper, and in the center sits a pristine white bathtub, innocent, ordinary, and yet the stage for something horrifying. That evening, as the woman prepares to bathe, Smith lingers by the door. The sound of water fills the room, mingling with faint laughter. Moments later, silence. When the landlady hears the splash and rushes in, she finds tragedy, the young bride drowned, her husband weeping beside her. A tragic accident, they say, but if you look closely, there's no grief in his eyes, only calculation. The next day, the funeral passes quietly. Another life claimed, another insurance claim waiting to be collected. And as the fog swallows the streets of London once more, George Joseph Smith walks away unnoticed, the perfect gentleman hiding the perfect crime. But this is only the beginning. The charming stranger has more brides to meet and more baths to fill. The fog never truly lifted from George Joseph Smith's trail. It only grew thicker with every new bride he claimed. As the months passed, he moved from one town to another, changing names, spinning lies, and weaving a web of deceit so convincing that no one ever looked twice. To the world, he was a grieving widower. In reality, he was a predator hiding behind vows and lace veils. In the quiet corners of England, the newspapers carried stories of tragedy, young bride drowned in bathing accident. To most, it was a coincidence. To Smith, it was a pattern, precise, controlled, and executed to perfection. He perfected his performance, the charming courtship, the wedding ceremony, the honeymoon suite, and then the bath. Each woman believed she was special. Each saw in him the promise of love and safety. When he took their hand at the altar, he wore a mask of tenderness, but beneath it, he was already calculating the timing, the insurance, and the perfect moment to strike. In one town, he arrived with a suitcase and a smile. He met a young woman through an introduction service, shy, kind-hearted, eager to build a future. Within weeks, they were married. The boarding house owner would later recall how polite he was, how devoted he seemed. No one imagined that the gentle husband would turn the honeymoon room into a crime scene. Inside the dimly lit room, a bathtub gleamed beneath a hanging lamp. To Smith, it wasn't a symbol of comfort, it was a weapon. He filled it halfway with water, ensuring just enough depth to drown without a mark. He had done it before. He knew the timing, the positioning, the force it took to hold her down until the bubbles stopped. When the landlady later entered the room, she found the same haunting sight, a young bride lifeless in the water, her pale face serene, as if she had simply fallen asleep. Smith wept convincingly, clutching his chest, shaking with false grief. "She must have fainted," he muttered through tears that never reached his eyes. Days later, he stood by another grave, his black hat low, his expression unreadable. As the coffin was lowered, he turned away, the faintest hint of satisfaction flickering across his face. With every death, he grew bolder, more confident that his perfect crime could never be traced. Meanwhile, the newspapers kept printing their headlines, "Tragic accidents strike again." The faces of the brides appeared side by side, smiling in their wedding gowns, unaware that they were bound by the same fate. Love turned to horror. But somewhere in Scotland Yard, a detective began to notice the pattern. Different towns, different names, but the same story, the same kind of death. The threads were starting to connect. As George Joseph Smith packed his suitcase once again and vanished into the mist, he believed he was untouchable. But the net was already tightening, and the ghosts of his brides were no longer silent. The calm arrogance that once cloaked George Joseph Smith began to fade as whispers spread through England's police stations. The pattern was too distinct, the deaths too similar. Somewhere deep inside Scotland Yard, a detective pinned 3 photographs to a board: 3 young brides, 3 identical tragedies, and one man connecting them all. The charming widower who had vanished into the fog was about to face the light of justice. It began with suspicion. The detectives retraced his steps: the church weddings, the boarding houses, the funerals. Witnesses described the same man: tall, polite, mournful eyes, always present when tragedy struck. Bit by bit, his web of lies unraveled. Letters revealed false names, marriage certificates showed overlapping dates, insurance documents bore his unmistakable signature. The evidence grew like a storm waiting to break. When the police finally closed in, Smith didn't resist. He stood in his London lodging, calmly folding his clothes into a suitcase as if preparing for another honeymoon. The constable's voice was steady as he read the charge: murder. Smith merely smirked, his confidence unshaken. To him, this was another performance, but this time the audience would see through the act. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The nation followed every word of the brides in the Bath trial. Reporters filled the gallery, their pencils scratching feverishly as witnesses spoke: landladies describing what they saw, doctors explaining how each woman had been drowned deliberately, not accidentally. The atmosphere was electric, heavy with horror and disbelief. As the prosecutor laid out the chilling pattern, the jury listened in stunned silence. 3 women, all found drowned in their baths. 3 marriages, each followed by an insurance policy. 3 lives stolen by the same man who once vowed to cherish them. The charm that once deceived so many now seemed grotesque, twisted by greed and cruelty. Smith sat in the dock, emotionless. His dark eyes stared straight ahead as the evidence mounted: the letters, the testimonies, the reenactments of how he forced his brides beneath the water. The truth left no room for doubt. His mask had shattered. The charming gentleman of the Lonely Hearts column was gone, replaced by the cold face of a murderer. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty of murder. Smith's expression didn't change. Perhaps he believed he'd outsmart death itself, but justice has a way of finding even the most careful deceivers. The prison walls were damp and cold, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken guilt. As he walked down the corridor toward the gallows, the echo of his footsteps seemed to carry the cries of the women he betrayed. No longer the charming stranger, only the condemned man. And when the noose tightened around his neck, George Joseph Smith met the fate he had so often delivered. The silence that followed was final, the end of the deceiver. But in the whispers of history, the brides in the bath still call from the water, reminding us that evil often wears the face of love.